Hi, my name is Pat, and this is my channel, Book Chat with Pat, and I'm glad that you're here. Today I'm going to be talking about my reading for week 3 of Rocket Summer. Rocket Summer is an event where we're reading classic vintage science fiction from the beginning of the genre in the 19th century through the 1960s. This event was created last summer by Michael K. Vaughan, and I am co-hosting the event with a group of wonderful booktubers, all of whom I will list in the notes below. This week, week 3, is devoted to the 1950s. I read 2 short stories with my friend Gareth at Books, Songs, and Other Magic, another co-host. We read stories from the Wesleyan Anthology of Science Fiction. We've been reading a couple of stories each week. And this week, the first story that we read together was Alfred Bester's Fondly Fahrenheit, which was first published in the Magazine of Science Fiction and Fantasy in 1954. It's the story of the very wealthy James Vandeleur and his multiple aptitude android. There is something very strange apparent right from the beginning of this story, as there is this weird and very deliberate jumbling of the first person and the third person pronouns, so that it can be difficult at times to figure out exactly who is telling the story, even from the very first sentence. We quickly learn that this very skilled android also seems to be a murderer whenever the temperature reaches a certain degree Fahrenheit. What we don't realize right away, but what soon becomes apparent, is that the owner of the android, Vandeleur, and the android really seem to be acting as one and the same entity. The mixing up of pronouns from first to third person is actually a sign of the madness of Vandeleur. Everywhere these two go together, whenever the temperature reaches a particularly high level, someone ends up dead. And Vandeleur and his android then quickly pack up and move to another location. It's only as the story progresses and as the narrative voice keeps changing that we begin to realize that Vandeleur and his android have somehow become one and the same, and that Vandeleur has clearly lost his mind. The story is considered a classic of both science fiction and horror, and people praise Bester's handling of multiple points of view. I didn't find the technique of changing points of view to be quite as masterful as some have called it. In fact, at first I thought it was a typo in the edition that I was reading. I thought that while it showed the mental state of the main human character, it also read in a kind of awkward and clunky way. I am sure it was considered very innovative in the 1950s. It just doesn't feel quite as innovative or as clever reading it today. And it felt more confusing and awkward. I mean, once I got to the end of the story and I realized what Bester was doing, and I went back and I reread it again, I could see the cleverness of it, but it didn't change the sort of awkwardness of the diction in the sentences, where we would start out in one person and end up in another person by the end of a sentence or a paragraph. We also read in the Wesleyan Anthology this week another Heinlein story. This one was All You Zombies, which was first published in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction in March of 1959. This is a story that explores time travel and intersexuality. The story opens with a young man who is referred to as the unmarried mother because he writes for a True Confessions type of magazine, often taking the point of view of an unmarried mother. So he's in a bar talking to a bartender, and the year is 1970. Both men reveal in this conversation that they came from unmarried parents. It is revealed that the young man was born as a girl in 1945 and raised in an orphanage. As a teen, she was seduced by an older man who also got her pregnant and then abandoned her. All of this comes out in this first conversation in the bar. During the delivery of her child, doctors discovered that she was actually an intersex person with internalized male and female parts. After a cesarean section was necessary to deliver the baby, there were complications that rendered the female parts unviable, and doctors performed a reassignment surgery of sorts, making the young woman now a young man, the young man that we see at the beginning of the story. Next, this young woman, now a man, realizes that their baby was kidnapped. The bartender tells this young man that he can take him to the man who seduced the young woman and then abandoned her, so that this now young man can get revenge. You still with me? This can be done through a time machine that the bartender happens to have access to. I'm not going to say any more about the plot because I don't want to spoil the plot. But the long and the short of it is that many of the different characters in this time travel story also sort of meld into one and the same character, much like the way Vandeleur and the android sort of meld into one character in Bester's story. I thought there was a real parallel between these two stories. This story, the Heinlein story, I think is a much more complex story, more complex than Bester's. And I also found it really hard to get my head wrapped around all of the changes in time, gender, and person. I had to actually map out in writing what was happening in each time jump, where we were in time, and to whom it was happening. I absolutely get why this story was considered to be so innovative. I am glad that I read it. I am even curious about the 2014 film Predestination, starring Ethan Hawke, which was based on Heinlein's story. I just don't love Heinlein's writing much beyond the series that he wrote for kids called The Juveniles. I read a bunch of those last summer for Rocket Summer, and I read a few more earlier this year with the new Futurian Fellowship, and I really like those. I think that they're They're fun, they're dated and they're corny, but they were really, really fun and compelling, and I just had a good feeling about all of those. I just struggle with Heinlein's writing for adults, and I've read a couple of his novels now and several of his short stories, and I think I'm going to stick to his juvenile series. And then finally, this week, I read my first ever John Wyndham novel. I read The Day of the Triffids. I like this book very much. This is a 1951 post-apocalyptic novel. Most people in the story have been blinded by an apparent meteor shower that they stared at. Our protagonist, Bill Mason, was not blinded because he just happened to already be in the hospital with some eye issues of his own, and his eyes were bandaged when this meteor shower occurred. And so he didn't stare at it, and he didn't lose his vision. So he wakes up in the hospital, and he removes the bandages from his eyes, and he realizes that he absolutely can see, but most of the people around him cannot. They are now completely blind, and there is just chaos everywhere. We quickly learn that the sighted people in this novel, and they're few and far between, they are now the targets and the enemies of the blinded people, who both despise those who are sighted and desperately need them because they need them in order to survive. So adding to this chaotic situation are the mysterious Triffids. Triffids are huge, ambulatory plants with deadly stingers. While they had been farmed for many years because of their very valuable oils, and they had been rendered pretty much harmless by human beings who removed their stingers, they are now running wild because there are no humans to hold them in check anymore, and they begin preying upon the humans as well. Bill joins forces with another sighted person that he rescues from a terrible situation, and that's Josella Playton, and theirs is very much a story about survival in a post-apocalyptic world where mob mentality is the rule of the day. I was immediately struck by echoes of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, which I had just read for week 1 of Rocket Summer. And I was really pleased to discover that Wyndham himself said that H.G. Wells' War of the World was one of his primary influences in writing this novel. I thought this was a really well-written novel with well-drawn characters and really powerful themes. And I am anxious to read more of John Wyndham. This is definitely one of the 2 best books that I have read for this year's Rocket Summer so far. And in reading about this novel after I finished it, I was really appalled to discover a lot of really hostile things that were written about it by other science fiction writers. I haven't really encountered that in my reading of other, vintage science fiction writers. I haven't seen this kind of, heavy-duty criticism of one another. I read things like, from other science fiction authors of his time, of Wyndham's time, calling this book derivative, safe, and even cozy, as in cozy, a cozy catastrophe novel, completely devoid of ideas. I was really, really shocked by this. However, there were others who absolutely sang its praises. Arthur C. Clarke, who is also one of the greats from the vintage period, Arthur C. Clarke called it a masterpiece. And even more recently, Margaret Atwood has become a champion of John Wyndham as well. I'm wondering if jealousy might have been at the root of some of the really ugly things that I read about Wyndham and about this novel. I don't know. I don't know enough about the people who said these really mean-spirited things. Anyway, we're moving now into the final week of Rocket Summer, and that's where we'll be reading about the 1960s. I am feeling the weight, though, of all of the bleakness of these post-apocalyptic stories that I've been reading this month. It hasn't been fun, lighthearted reading. It's been heavy and just very, very dark. Gareth and I will be continuing this week with our reading of short stories. We have Harlan Ellison, Brian Aldiss, and Ursula K. Le Guin on deck for week 4. And after chatting a bit this weekend with Sean D. Standfast, I think I might also try to add some Clifford D. Simak for the 1960s. So that's it for week 3 of Rocket Summer. As always, I thank you for watching. I hope that you're doing well. I'll speak with you again soon. Take care.